chances are you or someone you know has a coffee mug or maybe a canvas tote bag or, even a Halloween costume featuring Rosie the Riveter.
Oh, absolutely. I see it everywhere.
Right. You know the image immediately. It's got that bright yellow background, the woman in the crisp blue work shirt, the red polka dot bandana pulling her hair back.
And she's flexing her bicep.
Exactly, with that fierce expression and the big bold text saying, "We can do it." It is literally everywhere today.
It really is.
I mean, it has become the ultimate modern shorthand for wartime female empowerment, feminist solidarity, and just general industrial might.
Yeah, real symbol of strength.
But what if I told you that that specific poster was actually, well, corporate HR propaganda?
Right. Which completely flips the narrative.
It really does. Like the fact that it was designed by management primarily to suppress labor strikes and to subtly encourage the exact women who was supposedly celebrating to work harder while being systematically underpaid.
It completely shatters that shiny feel-good veneer we have, doesn't it?
Totally does.
Because we have this layered, glossy history of the American workforce during World War II, and, progress is generally seen as this one-way street where society crosses a threshold and just never looks back.
Right, like an unbroken march forward.
Exactly. But when you actually step onto the factory floors of the early 1940s, you are looking at a societal shift that is just mind-bending in its contradictions. It's the absolute definition of a deliberate, engineered historical anomaly.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking on our deep dive today.
We really need to get into the weeds on this.
We do. We are stripping away that ubiquitous pop culture mythology to uncover the massive, complex, and frankly, deeply unequal reality of women in the World War II workforce.
Because the truth is so much heavier than the myth.
Oh, absolutely. The truth of what happened on those assembly lines is so much more fascinating, and honestly, it's so much more grueling than a poster on a coffee mug.
To really grasp this, though, we can't just throw out macroeconomic statistics and talk about national policies.
No, that gets dry really fast.
Right. We need to ground this in a lived reality. We need to look through the eyes of someone who actually lived through that, that absolute whiplash.
Which brings us to our focal point today. I want to introduce you, the listener, to Rose Redondo Garcia.
Yes, Rose's story is so crucial here.
And just to be clear, she isn't a composite character invented for a movie or like a symbol cooked up by an ad agency.
She was a real person.
A real young woman who turned 18 in 1942, right as the United States was really shifting its wartime mobilization into high gear.
It was a chaotic time to come of age.
Totally. And we actually have her first-person account from a retrospective interview she gave back in 1995, where she's looking back on her life, and she's going to be our human anchor for this entire deep dive.
Rose's personal story is just invaluable because it so perfectly mirrors the entire national arc of this era.
It really tracks perfectly, doesn't it?
It does. If you map her experience, it tracks the exact trajectory of the whole country. You see the sudden, urgent recruitment. Then you see the exhilarating independence she found on this massive factory floor.
Yeah.
And then ultimately the abrupt, almost violent post-war dismissal.
Right. So using Rose as our lens, we kind of have to set the stakes right up front for you. The history we are diving into reveals a really stark, deeply uncomfortable contrast between that cheerful wartime propaganda we still consume today.
The tote bags.
Yeah, the tote bags, and the daily grinding reality of these women. We're going to ask you to hold two seemingly contradictory truths at once today.
Which is always the challenge with real history.
Exactly. First, this era represented a genuine, unprecedented, and really thrilling expansion of what women could do. I mean, it shattered the illusion of female incapacity on a global stage.
But the second truth, and the one we often ignore, is that this was a strictly racially tiered, fundamentally unequal arrangement, and it was designed from the very first blueprint to be entirely temporary.
Purely temporary. So let's start at the beginning. Before we can really understand the shock of an 18-year-old Rose Redondo Garcia walking onto a massive, deafening, heavy manufacturing floor in 1942, we have to understand the rigid world she was stepping out of.
The pre-war baseline.
Right. What did the American economy actually look like for a working woman in 1940?
It was a highly compartmentalized, incredibly contained economic footprint.
Contained how?
Well, before the wartime mobilization really kicked in, women made up roughly 27% of the United States workforce.
Which, on the surface might sound to you like a decent chunk. Over a quarter of the workforce.
It sounds substantial until you look closer.
Right, because that raw number hides the reality of the restrictions. It wasn't really about how many women were working. It was about where they were allowed to exist.
Precisely. The types of jobs available to women were severely restricted by this very deep societal consensus.
What were they doing?
They were almost exclusively relegated to clerical roles, domestic work, and various service jobs. So if you were a working woman in 1940, you were a secretary, a teacher, a nurse, a maid, a telephone operator, or a waitress.
And those environments were?
They were generally quiet, clean, and entirely subservient to a male-dominated management structure.
So there was a very clear ceiling and a very clear lane you had to stay in.
Absolutely.
And what about heavy industry? Like the factories, the shipyards, the places where raw steel is forged and heavy machinery is operated?
Virtually non-existent.
Really? Like zero?
Well, in heavy industry in 1940, women were basically a statistical rounding error. They made up roughly 1% of the workforce in those sectors.
1%. So an entire half of the population is effectively barred from the engines of industrial production.
Kept entirely out of the room.
You essentially have an economy operating with one hand deliberately tied behind its back. But then the catalyst arrives.
Right. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the rapid mobilization of the American military.
Everything changes overnight.
It really does. You suddenly have millions of working-age men being drafted or, volunteering for military service.
They're just gone.
Gone. They are emptying out of these factories and towns by the trainload, precisely at the exact moment when the government's demand for military production skyrockets to levels never seen in human history.
The arsenal of democracy needed workers, and it needed them yesterday.
Yes, the desperation was palpable.
And the sheer scale of the demographic earthquake that followed is, well, it's hard to even conceptualize. In just 5 years, the number of women in the workforce surged to nearly 19 million.
19 million. Just sit with that number for a second.
It's massive.
It pushed their share of the total U.S. workforce from that 27% up to nearly 37%.
Yeah.
That's a massive restructuring of the labor market in just half a decade.
And what really strikes me about this is that it wasn't just young single women entering the workforce, which, was somewhat socially acceptable before the war.
Right, the idea being you worked as a secretary until you got married.
Exactly. But the cultural shift breached those walls entirely. By the war's end, about 1 in 4 married women was working outside the home.
Which was completely unheard of.
Right. That is a massive structural deviation from the pre-war societal norms that aggressively insisted a married woman's place was strictly domestic.
It really shows how quickly deeply held cultural barriers fall when the economic imperative becomes absolute.
Necessity over tradition.
Exactly. The government and industrial magnates realized they simply could not build the ships, the tanks, the planes, and the artillery without tapping into this immense, intentionally unused labor pool.
I was actually trying to picture the sheer suddenness of this for you, the listener. And the best way I can visualize it is like flipping a master circuit breaker on an entire nation's potential.
Oh, that's a great way to think about it.
Right. Imagine a massive, sprawling power grid that has been intentionally left unplugged for generations. Society just decided, no, we don't route power through these lines. They aren't built for it.
They're too fragile, or whatever the excuse was.
Exactly. And then an emergency hits, the main generators fail, and the engineers run down to the basement and just slam that master breaker into the one position.
And suddenly everything lights up.
Suddenly all this dormant energy, 19 million nodes of human potential, are instantly electrified. They surge into the system, powering the factories, illuminating the production lines, doing things the system designers previously claimed those lines couldn't possibly handle.
I really like that framing because it highlights the sudden surge of energy. And that energy didn't just go into clerical offices.
Not at all.
To understand what this workforce expansion fundamentally changed about industrial manufacturing, we have to look at the physical reality of the work. We need to move from the macro statistics down to the sensory reality of the factory floor.
Which brings us right back to Rose.
Yes, back to Los Angeles.
At 18 years old, she steps out of that quiet pre-war baseline and goes to work in a massive Los Angeles aircraft manufacturing plant.
Right. And we have her exact memories of what that was like. She was assigned to the wing line.
The wing line.
Yeah. She describes performing a single repeated task on an aircraft wing, over and over, plane after plane.
Now contrast that with the pre-war jobs we talked about earlier.
The quiet offices.
Right. We are talking about environments now that are physically punishing, incredibly dangerous, and just deafeningly loud.
The sensory shock alone must have been profound for these women. These were brutal environments. You have women welding the massive steel hulls of Liberty ships at day area yards like Marin ship.
And let's be clear about what welding on a shipyard actually entails for you. It's not just holding a sparkler.
No, it is intense physical labor.
You are standing on precarious scaffolding, sometimes hundreds of feet in the air, or wedged into the suffocatingly tight, unventilated bowels of a ship's hull.
Just claustrophobic conditions.
You are managing intense heat, flying sparks, wearing heavy restrictive protective gear, breathing in noxious fumes all day long.
Exactly. And at the massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, which, by the way, was a mile-long facility built by Ford women, were riveting the aluminum skin onto B-24 bombers.
A mile long? That's a city under a roof.
It basically was. And these women were driving massive overhead cranes, working industrial lathes, and pouring molten metal for artillery shells in these hot, dangerous foundries.
It's a total paradigm shift. And nowhere is this more visible than in the aircraft industry itself. The demographic flip in that specific sector is almost unbelievable to look back on.
The numbers are wild.
By 1943, more than 310,000 women were working in aircraft manufacturing. They made up roughly 65% of the industry's entire workforce.
Let's just pause on that for a second. 65%.
Over half.
Way over half. In a field that was almost exclusively male, roughly 1% female, just 3 years prior, women are suddenly the overwhelming majority.
It is just staggering.
They are the primary hands building the planes that are fighting the war in the skies over Europe and the Pacific.
But wait, this brings up a massive logistical question for me. You don't just take 300,000 people who have never held a rivet gun or a welding torch, right?
People with zero industrial background.
Yeah. People whose prior mechanical experience might have been limited to a sewing machine or a typewriter, and just throw them onto a factory floor without the whole system collapsing.
It seems like it should have been a disaster.
So how did this rapid influx of entirely untrained workers fundamentally change the way industrial manufacturing processes were designed?
Well, this is really the crux of the wartime industrial miracle, and it's a brilliant piece of engineering. The plant managers had to adapt to their new workforce.
They had no choice.
Right. Under normal circumstances, you would spend years running apprentices through traditional programs to become master mechanics or shipwrights. They learn how to build the whole plane from the ground up.
Like craftsmen.
Exactly. But during the war, they didn't have years. They barely had weeks.
Right, the military is breathing down their necks, needing 10,000 bombers by next year. You cannot wait for a 5-year apprenticeship to finish.
So industrial engineers aggressively accelerated a concept that was already developing in manufacturing, the extreme division of labor. They took highly complex builds like a massive multi-ton B-24 bomber, and they broke the entire construction down into thousands of single, incredibly simple, repeatable tasks.
So instead of needing a team of master craftsmen to conceptualize and build a wing from start to finish,
You design an assembly line where the intelligence is built into the system itself, rather than requiring decades of training from the individual worker.
oh, that makes sense.
You take someone like Rose Redondo Garcia and you teach her how to do exactly one thing. You teach her how to buck one specific rivet on one specific panel.
Let's actually talk about what riveting is, because it sounds simple, but it is physically intense.
It is incredibly intense. It's essentially joining two pieces of metal together with a metal pin.
Okay, so how does that work in practice?
One person stands on the outside of the aircraft skin with a heavy pneumatic rivet gun. And this thing sounds like a machine gun. They use it to drive the rivet in.
And second person,
The other person, who is called the bucker, stands on the inside, usually in a really tight, cramped space, holding a heavy metal block called a bucking bar against the back of the rivet.
and as the gun hammers the rivet from the outside, the bucker uses their own body weight to press that bar against the metal so the tail of the rivet flattens out and seals the joint.
Exactly. And doing that vibrates your bones. It rattles your teeth.
And Rose would do that perfectly, hundreds of times a shift.
Yes. The genius of the industrial engineers was in de-skilling the individual tasks while maintaining the complexity of the final product.
Right.
It meant a completely new worker could be trained to be highly productive in a matter of days instead of years.
It's brilliant efficiency.
Hmm.
But through Rose's memories, we also see the psychological impact this had on the workers. Because despite the bone-rattling nature of the work, she didn't view it as torture.
Not at all.
Rose actually spoke with absolute delight about making her own way in the world. For the first time in her life, she's earning her own income.
And that financial autonomy is revolutionary for an 18-year-old girl in 1942.
Totally unprecedented.
She isn't dependent on a father or a husband for spending money anymore. She has her own paycheck with her own name on it.
Completely. And alongside that financial independence, there was a profound sense of camaraderie.
The social aspect was huge.
She talked about the shared focus on the factory floor. Everyone was united by this single overriding goal: ending the war and bringing the troops home.
That shared physical hardship and shared national purpose creates incredibly tight bonds between these women.
And it spilled over into her personal life, too. Rose remembered the nights out, going to dances with the other girls from the plant.
They were young, they wanted to have fun.
Right. They were working these exhausting shifts, but they were also experiencing a level of social freedom, peer connection, and just general mobility that many of them had never had access to before.
It was a brief, incredibly vibrant window of autonomy.
Sounds amazing.
It does, but here's where the story takes a sharp turn. Because that very de-skilling of the labor we just talked about, making the tasks simple and repetitive, combined with the gender of the new workforce, created a massive opening for economic exploitation.
Okay, let's look at this. So the work is de-skilled, meaning anyone can theoretically do it. And Rose feels empowered by her new income, going out to dances, feeling independent.
Yes.
You would think that this massive demand for labor would drive wages through the roof. But when you actually open these women's pay envelopes, the reality contradicts the empowerment narrative entirely.
It really does. If we look at the actual payroll records of the era, the numbers tell a very different story than the smiling faces on the factory floor.
Okay, let's break this down for you like we're in a classroom for a second. Think about the basic economics we all experience in our daily lives. Supply and demand.
The foundational rule of economics.
Exactly. In a normal market, when there is a massive shortage of something like millions of men leaving the labor pool, combined with an incredibly high demand for a product like the military needing endless supplies of aircraft, the price of labor goes up.
It has to.
Right. Employers are desperate, so they should be forced to offer highly competitive premium wages to attract and retain whoever's left to do the work. The workers should have immense leverage in that situation.
Basic economic logic dictates that women stepping into these roles should have commanded top dollar.
So what happened?
Well, here is where the artificial distortion of societal prejudice bypasses fundamental economics. The sheer scale of the wage theft, and it was wage theft justified entirely by the fact that the workers were female, is staggering.
Let's look at a concrete example so you can really picture this. Let's go back to that Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan.
The mile-long Ford plant.
Yes. You have women working as riveters doing that heavy, bone-rattling physical labor on the line. What were they taking home?
At Willow Run, women riveters were earning 85 cents an hour.
85 cents. And what about the men working at the exact same plant?
Men doing the exact same identical work, bucking the exact same rivets on the same assembly lines, were earning $1.20 an hour.
85 cents versus $1.20.
Yes.
That's not some slight discrepancy. They are paying women roughly 30% less for doing the exact same manual labor on the exact same plane.
And Willow Run wasn't an isolated incident either. Across various sectors of the wartime economy, women were frequently paid no more than half of male wages for equivalent work.
Half. They are literally building the machinery to save the free world for 50 cents on the dollar.
It is a fundamentally exploitative economic reality.
It's infuriating.
Yeah.
But the way we remember this era, the way it's taught in schools and celebrated, totally ignores this systemic wage theft.
Completely glosses over it.
Which brings us back to the elephant in the room we started with. We have to deconstruct the poster myth.
Yes, the "we can do it" poster.
Yes, the ultimate modern symbol of female empowerment. We see it and we think, look how strong and valued women were during the war.
That's certainly what it feels like it means today.
But what is the actual history of that specific image?
Well, that image was created in 1943 by an artist named J. Howard Miller, but it was absolutely not a massive national government-sponsored recruitment campaign.
It wasn't.
No, it was an internal morale poster created specifically for the Westinghouse Electric Corporation.
It was just corporate internal communications.
Exactly. It was displayed in Westinghouse factories for a grand total of about 2 weeks in February 1943.
2 weeks.
Just 2 weeks. And its primary purpose wasn't to champion women's rights or even to recruit them. It was designed by management to boost morale, discourage labor strikes, and push workers, both men and women, actually, to work harder and faster for the company.
Wow.
But during the actual war, the general public essentially never saw it.
This blows my mind. The ultimate symbol of the era was barely a blip on the radar during the actual era. So how did it become the icon we all know today?
It only became a symbol of female empowerment decades after the war had ended. It was rediscovered in the National Archives in the early 1980s.
Oh, wow, the 80s.
Yeah, and it was embraced by the feminist movement then. But in doing so, the image was completely divorced from the reality of the wartime pay gap we just discussed.
So it lost all its context.
Exactly. It's a visually inspiring image, sure, but it projects a modern sensibility backward onto an era that was systematically underpaying the very women the poster was allegedly celebrating.
Think about the incredible irony of this for a second. We use this image to celebrate the empowerment of the era, but it was actually just corporate HR material distributed by the very companies that were actively colluding to bypass free market economics so they could systematically underpay those women.
Yes.
It's like celebrating a poster that basically says, work harder for less pay.
It is a profound historical irony. The iconography we've adopted sells a story of pure empowerment, but the historical pay envelopes contradicted it entirely.
So if the Westinghouse poster wasn't the real Rosie, who were the real wartime icons?
Right.
What were people actually looking at and listening to in 1943?
There were two genuine contemporary cultural touchstones. First, there was a massive 1942 hit song, literally titled Rosie the Riveter, which popularized the name and the concept across the country.
So it started as a song.
It did, and visually, the Rosie that most Americans actually recognized during the war was a 1943 magazine cover by Norman Rockwell.
The Saturday Evening Post cover.
Yes, published in May 1943. And Rockwell's Rosie is profoundly different from the sanitized Westinghouse poster.
How so?
She is heavily muscular, her face is dirty, she has a massive heavy rivet gun resting across her lap, she's eating a sandwich on her lunch break, and her foot is literally resting on a crushed copy of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf.
Yeah, that is an image.
It's incredible.
She looks exhausted, gritty, and incredibly strong. It's a much harder, more realistic depiction of the physical toll of heavy industrial labor.
It was much closer to the reality of the factory floor. But even Rockwell's powerful, gritty image couldn't capture the deeper structural inequalities at play.
What do you mean?
Because as jarring as the pay gap was for white women like Redondo Garcia, the industrial boom was layered in ways that were even more restrictive.
And this is where the story gets even darker. To fully understand this era, we can't just look at the assembly line. We must look at who was entirely blocked from even reaching the assembly line.
Right.
We have to examine a hierarchy within the hierarchy.
We need to look at how the industrial expansion opened unevenly based on race, specifically examining the experience of Black women.
We talked about how white women were leaping from clerical and domestic work to relatively high-paying factory jobs. But for Black women, the historical record details a double exclusion.
Yes, they were facing a compounding intersection of prejudices.
Walk us through that.
Black women were dealing with the exact same sex discrimination that all women faced regarding assumptions about their physical capabilities and their place in the workforce.
Right. The women can't lift heavy things myth.
Exactly. But compounded on top of that was the severe institutionalized racial discrimination that structured the American economy in the 1940s.
So what did that actually look like in practice when a Black woman showed up at the factory gates looking for work during this massive labor shortage?
Even as the door opened for white women to move into these skilled, better-paying industrial jobs like Rose moving to the wing line or women learning to weld on the shipyards, Black women were deliberately and systematically shut out of those specific opportunities.
They were kept away from the rivet guns and the welding torches entirely.
Largely, yes. The documentation indicates that Black women were systematically channeled into the hardest, dirtiest, most hazardous, and lowest paid tasks available within the industrial complex.
So if they got into the factory at all, they weren't building the plane. What were they doing?
Often, they were hired for grueling janitorial work within the massive plants,
Okay.
or they were placed in the most physically punishing divisions, like the foundries, where the heat was unbearable and the labor was backbreaking, or they were sent to the dope rooms.
Wait, what was a dope room?
In aircraft manufacturing, dope was a highly toxic, flammable chemical lacquer that was painted onto the fabric surfaces of airplanes to stretch and seal them.
Oh, man. That sounds awful.
It was terrible. The rooms were poorly ventilated, the fumes were overwhelming, and the work was incredibly hazardous to the workers' health.
And who was doing this work?
White women were generally kept out of these rooms, while black women were funneled directly into them.
Oh.
And many other black women were simply denied factory work altogether, kept in the low-paying domestic and service roles they had been confined to before the war, completely denied the chance to participate in the lucrative manufacturing boom.
You look at this structure, and it just shatters the myth entirely. The so-called open door of wartime labor wasn't an open door at all for you if you weren't the right demographic.
It really wasn't.
It was more like a highly filtered funnel. Think about it. The economy was desperate for labor, but society was still strictly sorting opportunity by demographics.
The hierarchy remained intact.
Exactly. The white men retain the supervisory roles and the highest pay. White women get the skilled assembly jobs at a severe 40% discount, and black women are filtered down to the absolute bottom of both ladders, forced into the most toxic, grueling work for the least amount of money.
Yes.
It's a remarkably rigid, oppressive system operating right in the middle of a national emergency.
It perfectly underscores the tension we established at the beginning. The expansion was genuine, it undeniably changed lives, but the welcome was incredibly conditional.
Conditional is the perfect word for it.
And nowhere was that conditionality more brutally enforced than at the end of the war.
Which brings us to VJ Day, victory over Japan, and the deliberate rollback.
The end of the era.
Just as quickly as the war created this new massive workforce, the end of the war dismantled it. Everyone, the government, the employers, the unions, and many of the women themselves, understood this arrangement was for the duration.
Right, that was the phrase.
But the speed and the ferocity of the reversal was devastating.
Let's return to Rose Redondo Garcia to anchor this macro event back in her personal experience.
In her interview, Rose describes the sudden crashing end of this chapter of her life.
How did she describe it?
Well, the war ends, the Japanese surrender, and almost overnight, the vibrant, independent world she had built over the last 3 years vanishes.
Just gone.
The aircraft factories close their doors or drastically scale back production. The nights out at the dances stop. The camaraderie of the line is fractured.
And the jobs.
And the few jobs that remain on the factory floor are immediately given to returning servicemen. The door just slams shut on Rose.
Her personal whiplash is perfectly reflective of the macro statistics of the post-war layoffs.
Give us the numbers on that.
The numbers are staggering. In the single month following Japan's surrender in September 1945, just 1 month, some 2.5 million workers were laid off.
2.5 million people lose their jobs in 30 days.
Yes.
To put that in perspective for you, that is the equivalent of the entire modern-day population of Chicago losing their jobs between breakfast and dinner.
And these cuts fell overwhelmingly and disproportionately on women. Roughly a quarter of all women working in factories lost their jobs within months of VJ Day.
A 25% reduction in the female industrial workforce almost instantaneously. How did they execute that so fast? You don't just fire 2.5 million people without a structural mechanism in place.
You certainly don't.
What were the actual levers used to push women out?
Well, there were several interlocking mechanisms at play. First, there were strict seniority rules enforced by the unions and management. Last hired, first fired.
Wait, but unions are supposed to protect workers? Seniority rules sound fair on paper?
They do, in a vacuum.
How did protective rule end up weaponized against the women who just spent 3 years saving the industry?
Because of the pre-war baseline we discussed at the very beginning, because women had been systematically barred from heavy industry before 1941, they inherently had the least seniority of anyone in the plant.
That's great.
So when the massive layoffs began, the last hired, first fired rule automatically and precisely targeted the female workforce first, completely disregarding their skill level, their productivity, or their essential contributions during the war.
I see. It's a structural trap.
Exactly.
The historical discrimination from before the war guarantees they're the first ones cut after the war. What else do they use?
Then you had returning veterans' preferences. There was a massive government-backed mandate to ensure that returning soldiers had jobs waiting for them.
Which makes sense.
It does, but the overriding cultural assumption attached to that was that a job held by a woman was a job that rightfully belonged to a man who had fought overseas, regardless of how well the woman was actually performing it.
So women weren't just laid off due to scalebacks. They were outright replaced.
Yes, and backing all of this up was a fierce, coordinated cultural messaging campaign.
Oh, propaganda shifted.
It completely reversed. The exact same government agencies, ad executives, and media outlets that spent the last 4 years churning out posters, begging women to pick up rivet guns and build ships, suddenly flipped the script entirely.
Wow.
They launched a massive propaganda effort pushing women out of well-paid manufacturing and aggressively back toward domesticity.
It is incredible psychological whiplash. You go from magazines declaring, "We can do it, pick up a welding torch, save the world," to suddenly opening a magazine in 1946, and the ads are saying, "Thank you for your service. Now your highest calling is to go back to the kitchen, buy a new vacuum cleaner, and make a beautiful home for your husband."
Exactly.
They used the full force of cultural media to re-stigmatize the working woman, making it seem unnatural or greedy for a woman to want to keep her factory job.
It was a very deliberate, engineered return to the pre-war social order. They had to put the genie back in the bottle.
This raises a big question for me, though. When these massive layoffs happened and this cultural pressure mounted, were the women universally heartbroken to be pushed out?
That is a great question.
Because the narrative is often told as this great tragedy where they were all dragged, kicking and screaming from the factories. Is it really that simple?
That's a vital nuance to add. The historical picture is absolutely mixed, and we really have to avoid a single, tidy narrative here.
How so?
On one hand, many women did fight fiercely to stay. They had tasted financial independence, they enjoyed the skilled work, and frankly, they needed the money.
Right.
Surveys from the time show that a significant majority of women working in war industries explicitly wished to keep their jobs. For them, the push-out was devastating. They were losing their livelihoods and their newfound autonomy.
Right, like Rose, who loved the independence and the camaraderie.
But on the other hand, there were women who were deeply relieved the war was over and willingly chose to leave the grueling factory work.
Because the work was so hard?
We have to remember how hard, dangerous, and exhausting this labor was.
Right.
Imagine a woman who was working 60 hours a week in a deafening, freezing shipyard, doing bone-rattling physical labor, while also trying to manage a household with a husband in danger overseas.
That sounds completely exhausting.
When the war ended and her husband returned, leaving that brutal industrial job was a welcome relief for some. The layoffs and the cultural pressure were very real, systemic forces, but individual women navigated that reality with very diverse personal motivations.
That makes perfect sense. It respects their agency in a highly complex situation.
Yeah,
Not everyone wants to buck rivets for the rest of their lives.
exactly.
So the war ends.
Hmm.
The door is closed. The men are back. The women are pushed out. And the traditional order is seemingly restored by 1946.
Seemingly.
But as we look at the legacy of this era, we have to look at the permanent alteration. Because you can't just unring a bell of this magnitude.
No, you really can't. Despite the immediate post-war pushback, despite the massive layoffs and the vacuum cleaner propaganda, this temporary shift permanently altered the public perception of women workers. And much more importantly, it altered women's perception of themselves.
The war genuinely showed, at a massive, undeniable national scale, that women could do the work. They could build the bombers.
They could weld the ships.
They could operate the massive cranes. The foundational societal illusion of female physical and mental incapacity was shattered in front of the entire world.
And those 19 million women carried the visceral knowledge of their own capacity into the post-war decades.
Think about what that means for a generation. The door was deliberately closed, yes. The systemic inequalities in pay and the brutal racial hierarchies were profound and unforgivable.
Absolutely.
But the seeds were planted. A woman who welded the hull of a Liberty ship in 1943 might have been pushed back to being a housewife in 1946, but she raised her daughters knowing exactly what she was capable of.
The lived experience doesn't just disappear.
The memory of that independence, the tangible, physical proof of their own competence, became a quiet, unshakable foundation that fed directly into the women's movements that gathered explosive force in the 1960s and 70s.
The precedent was set. The boundary of what was thinkable had been permanently moved, and no amount of post-war propaganda could completely erase that.
Which brings me back to the thought we started with today. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. We talked at the beginning about an illusion so convincing that society builds its entire economy around it.
The pre-war baseline.
Right. We've seen how the American economy relied on the absolute illusion that women, an entire half of the demographic, were physically and temperamentally incapable of complex, heavy industrial labor. That illusion was deemed strictly necessary to maintain the pre-war social order.
The baseline demanded that illusion be treated as a biological fact.
But then, a global emergency forces society to prove unequivocally on assembly lines across the country that the illusion was always a lie.
The bombers flew.
The ship sailed. The work was done. So what happens to the psyche of a society when its foundational myths are exposed like that?
It's a profound question.
Once a population 19 million women discovers their own immense untapped capacity, can a society ever truly convince them to forget it? They tried their hardest to close the door, but you can't erase the memory of what it felt like to walk through it. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.